All right, good afternoon. This is Chapter 14, Lecture C. We'll hopefully get through the remainder of the chapter today. We've been talking about the Civil War as we keep progressing through here. We got into some of the war strategies, and then some of the aims of the war, and then how the evolution of emancipation came to fruition. One thing that was important to remember is in 1860-61, when Lincoln's elected and comes into office, he's not running on the premise to abolish slavery, just stop the expansion. However, throughout the war, as we ended yesterday's or Tuesday's lecture, we talked about how by 1863 it had morphed into, okay, now it is time to end slavery in all parts, and the whole change in that. So the Second American Revolution, Liberty, Union, and Nation. This is Second American Revolution, slide 1. So the definition of freedom was firmly established as the Norse version at the conclusion of the war, which we can kind of look back and understand that. But that wasn't the case in 1863 quite yet. There was no modern nation building going on in the world at this time. The world kind of was going as a series of flux, actually, if you look at the rest of the world. To Lincoln, the American nation embodied, instead of a set of universal ideas, centered on political democracy and human liberty. And really, even though the British were have been going through their own changes from the American Revolution on, America was the premier republic or democracy elements that had not really been tried out for long periods in the world. So we do have some unique elements going on there. But Lincoln's vision, and actually I just saw it quoted the other day in the news again, or the World War I Museum that I'm getting ready to take my sophomore class on, talking about the World War I Museum. But the Gettysburg Address really summarizes Lincoln's vision of the United States going forward, and talking about, I know I'm going to butcher the quote, but by the people, for the people, and all that, like how the people do control this country. And the term nation replaces the term union. And this is something you can have a long discussion on. There's a lot of scholarship on it about how Lincoln takes the term union and starts using the word nation, and that's a unique study if you want to get into that. And like a union is a lot different terminology if you think about nation. Nation's a group of people that have common beliefs, common structure. So it's kind of a cool way to look at it. Okay, the Second American Revolution, 2, the war in American religion. Though the war produced a large amount of deaths, Protestant churches justified the deaths and reassured that the dead had not died in vain. So as you have massive amounts of death, you need the justifications that people that are dying aren't dying for worthless causes. Christianity and patriotism, ridding the country of slavery will become a moral good. South also preached that they were on God's side, but really in the North you get much more justification, like, okay, ridding slavery is much more moralistic, it's a good thing. And so when people die, and it's the single bloodiest war the United States has ever fought, over 600,000 people, it's very important for people to have rationale to sleep at night that their loved ones died with a purpose. Enabled Americans to cope with that death that I talked about, an elaborate recording system of the dead. One thing that's kind of cool, and I think I've showed you guys before in my class, it's not, I can pull that, it's over there. Someone in my family did an extensive genealogy record, and they came across a relative of mine, a Heron. He has like 5 different names, like William Henry, blah, 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 Heron. He was a lieutenant in the Union Army, and he died in, I can't remember what battle it was, but it's all extensive records. And now you have record keeping where people died, where they were buried, to accommodate that. It's kind of the forerunner. They didn't have dog tags yet, but it was a good way to keep track of everything that was going on. After the war, embarked to create national cemeteries and rebury the dead, which we have across the country. You'll come across Civil War cemeteries and such. And really starting with the Civil War, you start to see mass cemeteries built. You'll have them accumulate in a lot of other things across the other wars, like World War I, World War II, and so on. There's a lot of graves around the world. I've been to the World War I cemetery that America has in France. Pretty awesome place to see. And so, yeah. Moving on to liberty in wartime. Criticism of the war effort seemed to Republicans equivalent to treason. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Arguably, and I've talked about this before, and I know we've talked about it in history class and government class, when Lincoln suspended the habeas corpus, one of the most controversial decisions that he made, and sometimes that's where people call him a tyrant. Ex parte Milligan declared it illegal, but the reality was Lincoln was not a despot. He was, but showed the fragility of the civil rights in the face of assertive patriotism and wartime demands for unity. Essentially, what you're looking at with this decision, and we've talked about it before, is with Lincoln, he was doing what was ever necessary to preserve the Union. Now, we talked about writs of habeas corpus, and I think actually in my government class, who you guys are in here right now take, we talked about habeas corpus, the right to a trial, knowing what you're being accused of. So if you go to jail, Ethan or Gabe, you're going to know exactly what you're being held in jail for, right? When habeas corpus is suspended, you don't get that guaranteed to you. And basically what Lincoln does is, because going back to that treason element, there was newspaper people that were arguing why the war should end and all this sort, starts jailing those opponents by suspending it, and then throughout the duration of the war, they're silenced. And they're looking, and the whole justification is preserving national unity. So that's, if you ever come across, and there's people that put Lincoln lower ranked on presidents, because if I asked to poll across all the classes I teach today, probably the top presidents are going to always be, we'll have Washington then in there, Jefferson maybe mentioned there, but Lincoln is usually in there as well. But there's a lot of scholars that do not like him, and it's for that reason. Second American Revolution, slide number 3, the North's transformation. North experienced wartime prosperity. Unlike the South, the war is not fought in the North. The North's industry is going to explode. They're selling stuff, the economy is going, people are spending money, federal government power expanded, people had a lot of jobs, there's a lot of opportunities, industrial boom, even agricultural flourished because you had to feed the troops. So there's a lot of good things going on in the North. It is. Business is good in the North. They are built on trade. They're built on factories. Stuff's good. Government and the economy, new nation state was committed to rapid economic development. You'll have the Homestead Act passed, I believe, in 1862, which offered 160 acres of free public land for settlers in the West. And I actually believe there was a small fee. I think sometimes it was, I want to say $5 or $10, if I remember right, attached to it. But if you signed that contract, you had to live on the land for at least 5 years. What's the weather like in January in Nebraska? Out on the plains? What was it like Sunday and Monday? What was the weather like here as far as the wind? It was super windy, right? 40-mile-per-hour wind gusts. I saw the tit in my neighbor's backyard blow over the fence that had been out there since July. Point of it was super strong winds, right? You go in your house, we here at the school, we don't really hear it or feel it. Imagine you signed the Homestead Act, which committed you to the land for at least 5 years. You couldn't move off of it for at least 5 years or sell it. And you go out there, build your little hut, and then you get those winter winds, or summer winds sometimes you would call them, out there on the plains. You think it would be very enjoyable? So the Homestead Act was great, but people moved to the Midwest. They're like, So that's the reason they put that limit on there, I think. I don't know if there's any truth to that far as, but you think about it, if you're going to get people to invest in you want to keep them on that land. You don't want them to move. Also, let's see here, huge grants of money and land for internal improvements. 100 million acres is given to Union Pacific and Central Pacific for the Transcontinental Railroad to be built, and it'll be completed by 1869. So after the Civil War, but they'll start the process during the Civil War. So the North, though the Civil War is going on, they're still thinking long-term. They're not looking just short-term. They're looking at improvements and such as they go forward. So there's a lot of stuff going on, even as the war is going on. The West and the war. So this is Second American Revolution, slide number 4, for those of you who followed along. The West and the war. Not sad about the far west, Missouri, Kansas, and Indian Territory. In October of 1961, Texas tried to invade New Mexico with the idea of manifest destiny and slavery. To be defeated at Glacier Pass, and Texas was forced to retreat back. So as we've talked manifest destiny over and over again, though the term, there's a lot of debate about the origin of the term, which probably the best time the term came about, 1845, as a newspaper article, by Sullivan, I think it was. The point of this is Texas is like, hey, we're going to try to take New Mexico. We're part of the South. It's moving west, and it fails miserably. Indian Territory, army recalled in conflict between white settlers and Indians. Will escalate. 300 Indians were arrested for killing 100 of white farmers in Minnesota. All but 38 sentences were commuted by Lincoln, though. 38 were still hung. It's still the largest public execution by the U.S. government. Other Indian problems occurred in the West. So as the military focuses on the Civil War, essentially, you're going to see there's going to be issues with Native Americans arise. This being said, these 300 Indians were sentenced for killing 100 of white farmers, or about 100 white farmers or whatever. Most of them was stuff. There's a lot of dispute about what the actual conflict was, how many actually died. But Lincoln steps in and says, we're not going to execute all 300 of them. But he still executes a few of them to send a message. You don't need to execute all of them to drive home the point you're trying to do, which it does stop some of the violence. I do commend him for that, but obviously still hanging 38 Indians is still a pretty dramatic effect. And it's, like I said, still the largest public execution by the U.S. government to this day. A new financial system, increased tariffs to unprecedented heights, new taxes on good as well. Borrowed more than $2 billion by selling interest-bearing bonds, $400 million worth of paper money. This is really where you start to see the increase of greenbacks or paper money. Paper money had been used before, but this is really where you start to see the expansion of paper money. Paper money had used to be laughed at a little bit because does the paper actually contain any value? No, not in it. And that's why people preferred precious metal coins, because the silver, copper, whatever, the older coins contained what they were worth generally. So now when they start to move to paperbacks, it has to be backed by something. And that's an evolution that goes on throughout that period. Post-war consolidation industry. As the war comes to an end and you go into the 1870s and 1880s, the transformation of the North is going to be Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, as we've talked about in my American history class before, the rise of big business, steel, oil, and America's banking might. All of this created a larger, more powerful government. This all doesn't end with the Civil War, obviously, but it gets its start in the 1860s, and it's going to shape a lot of that future policies. Second American Revolution, number 5, women in the war. Women's role expanded during the war, worked primarily as nurses, clerks, and even in some factory jobs, all short-lived. You will not see the massive expansion of women in war until really World War I and probably more World War II. Even World War I, they're still limited to primarily just nurses overseas. One thing to note about women that will be used during this is you have camp women, especially still at this period. Camp women will be obviously one of Pershing's things in World War I. We're going to the World War I Museum tomorrow. One of Pershing's biggest problems he had to deal with was prostitution in France. You had camp women that would follow the army wherever they went. And that was still an issue in the Civil War, even before the World War I. That was an issue that would massive amounts of men move through an area. Things tend to happen. I'm not going to go further than that. You can understand where I'm going with this. Soldiers need to have something to give them a break. It's either women or alcohol. Women usually tend to have a lot less side effects than alcohol does, because alcohol tends to lead to a lot worse decisions. Now, the divided North wasn't all rosy in the North, obviously. The war and Lincoln's administration policy divided the North. Republicans were labeled, those who opposed the war, copperheads. And we all know what a copperhead snake is, very poisonous snake in our area. Do not want to come across them. Republicans will label those who oppose the war as copperheads, trying to strike and really hurt the Union. Dissatisfaction was strongest among the larger southern-born population of states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And riots in New York over the draft will start in 1863. So, though the economy, things are going decently well in the North as far as economics, there's still internal strife about what's going on in the war. It's not everyone's happy about it. People don't want to be drafted. But the reality, though, at the end of the day, the fighting's not happening in the North. So they don't see the everyday effects of war. They're not being shelled. They're not having guns they're not having all these troops moving through their area. So the war is relatively not visible to those in the North. The Confederate nation. Now, we talked about a lot of the transformation in the North. The South, the Confederate nation. Leadership and government. Jefferson Davis became the president, lacked Lincoln's flexibility and ability to communicate the war's meaning effectively. Jefferson Davis had been in Congress for many years. He left Congress when South Carolina and the other states started declaring or breaking away and seceding. He will be elected their president, but the problem about Jefferson Davis, he was not Lincoln. He did not have the charisma. He did not have the balance. He could not effectively communicate to the southern states what the meaning of the war was or what the purpose was, rather than we don't want an all control of government. South became more centralized but failed with cotton. So what you're going to see, they're going to have King Cotton diplomacy. So when they set their government up, they essentially modeled it after the Articles of Confederation, like we had after the American Revolution, which put all the power in the states. The problem with that is just the same problem. The reason we created the Constitution and the federal government is they didn't have the power to tax. They didn't have the power to do a lot of stuff. So Jefferson Davis would ask, hey, I need some money or I need some troops. South Carolina, Georgia said, hey, no, we're not going to give you any money. We're not going to give you anything. And so that really impeded the power that the Confederate government had. The other thing is they put all their eggs in one basket with what they call King Cotton diplomacy. Reduction of cotton, try to make the British and other countries come to the South. Aid failed because guess what? Before the Civil War, I think it was like 60-70% of cotton production came from the South. Great Britain looked and goes, hey, I think it was India, but they looked at their colonies. Hey, we've got like places like India, we've got these other places. We're going to start investing cotton there. We don't need to mess with the American Civil War. And we also can cut out the middleman and we can make more money in the end. So when the South uses King Cotton diplomacy, it backfires and results in massive consequences because then they don't have any money really outside of cotton that they can fall back on, and they start going broke. The inner Civil War, as the war raged on, internal conflict raged the South. They had their biggest enemy was getting along, like I said, and working together. One major grievance was the draft. Could provide a substitute or use slaves. Once again, the Southern economy was based off of a feudal-like society. At the top, you have a very small planter class, which would be the rich, the elites. Then you have a very large group of poor white farmers that had no slaves. They barely could survive. And then you had a large population of slaves that were obviously indebted. And then free blacks were in there as well, but which was very, very, very few. Point of this is most of the people that are drafted come from the poor white class, and they're like, they don't have slaves, they'll never have slaves, they're spit on by the planter class, and they're really like, what's this war purpose? Is this benefiting me? The 20 Negro provision convinced many yeomen that the struggle for Southern independence had become a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Going back to that whole structure there is like, what am I really fighting for? These plantation owners are also not fighting, or they're getting the sweet jobs. They're the colonels, they're the officers, but they have no experience. All right, Confederate Nation 2. Economic problems. Shortages grew as the war progressed. The war left countless farmers, plantations, businesses, and railroads in ruins. Public support declined. Poor were convinced they were being unfair advantage for the burdens of the upper class. Planter Congress was unwilling to levy taxes to pay for the war. Impressment of farms and poor spread by Confederate officers. You're going to have Confederate officers go to Confederate farms looking for resources such as food and other things to help them fight the war. Now, Gabe or Ethan, if you have a farm and you're not part of the war, are you going to be and you don't necessarily support the war, and all of a sudden Confederate troops come to take food from your land, are you going to be very happy? No, you're not. So you have a lot of those internal problems start to spread up as the war drags on. Early on, they kind of appeased, went through it, because everyone was the early onsets of war. Usually, everyone's got excitement, people will work, but then as it drags on, all these issues start coming to fruition. Women in the Confederacy, women in the South bore an evil, heavier toll. Left on the plantation struggled to survive. Those without slave labor found it very difficult to exist without their husband's labor. Honestly, I'm not necessarily a fan of it. The Gone with the Wind movie and book series, or books that talk about the plight of the woman and everything as the husband goes off to fight and everything. There is some truth in that, where the women, they were left to run the farms. And the sad reality was, if you did not have slaves, That meant the women were out there toiling on the farm, and a lot of them didn't have the experience on how to run the farm. And that's not any knock on women. It was just the way it was existing at the time. And so you have a very huge problem back in a lot of the farms, especially if those farmers there is no slaves, of the wife trying to run the farm by herself or with her sons or whoever. Black soldiers in the Confederacy mostly worked as laborers. Yes, black soldiers were used in the South's army, but at the end, recruitment of black slaves to fight was being organized, but it's also going to backfire, going back to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln was a brilliant stroke, being a military operation and order, undercut one of the advantages the South was trying to use, which was their massive labor force with blacks. If blacks got wind of the freedom, they are not going to give a darn about the Southern, like, hey, we'll give you, no. If they've got freedom opportunity now, they're going to take it. I mean, there might be some because of logistics or families not being able to move or flee, but the reality is this undercuts the South a lot. Okay, turning points 1, Gettysburg and Vicksburg. As I have alluded to before, this is not a military history study class, but we do talk about the major turning points and stuff. Lee gambled with an invasion of the North, and this is where he's going to try to invade up past, he kind of skirts around Washington, D.C., and goes into Pennsylvania. He will be stopped by General George Meade, who led the Union Army. This battle will be fought over about 2 to 3 days, July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. 165,000 troops fought, remains the largest battle ever fought in North America. The largest battle that the Americans ever fought in was World War I at the Argonne Offensive, over 600,000. But this is the largest ever fought, or at least recorded, in North America. July 3rd, Pickett's charge failed, and Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. This battle is almost a draw. It is fought around a hilltop where the Union forces were at. And fortunately, Pickett's charge, which goes back to one of the word of the weeks I've had in the class, which is the cult of the offensive, is the belief that a charge with well-motivated men and trying to bum rush something, you're going to overtake them. The problem is when you run right into bullets, that generally fails pretty miserably. Being in the military myself, I would not want to run into a hail of bullets. On July 4th, 1863, hang on, back up, I missed a spot here. As Gettysburg is wrapping up, Grant began a siege on Vicksburg in 1862, and that will end on July 4th at 1863. So you have two major battles, one being a siege and one being longer with Vicksburg and the one being a shorter. Two major Union victories back to back. This cements Grant's claim to fame with the Vicksburg campaign. Vicksburg was a key city on the Mississippi River. I could go into great detail about that in a longer class, but Grant demonstrates his ability to take something that was deemed untakeable. By 1864, Grant is promoted. So Lincoln had we talked about McClellan, a great trainer of troops, but ineffective on the battlefield. After he fired McClellan, Lincoln went through a series of people until he finally promoted Grant. Grant above some superiors, which made some people mad because he was not the senior officer. He's promoted and uses a war of attrition against Lee in the South. Now the thing about Grant is that we go back to Lincoln, is that he fights, and Grant does whatever Lincoln needs him to do. He's willing to pay high prices, which will lead to his alcoholism later after the war. The reason Grant became a drinker was because he fought a war in which he did whatever was necessary to win. And you send thousands of men to your death, that will have an effect on anybody. I don't care who you are. Grant realized he must attack continuously, use his superiority. In 1864, he dragged on, and thousands of men, as the 1864 dragged on, thousands of men died fighting. Grant will get the Butcher of Men name, comes back like he's killing all these men. The reality is he's just fighting a war of attrition, trying to wear the South down, which he does. Sherman finally broke through and took Atlanta. Basically, as Grant is chasing Lee, he says Sherman, who's his chief lieutenant, colonel, I think he was a colonel at the time, says, go through the South, take Atlanta, and just burn and pillage everything, essentially. And that's what Sherman does. And it causes basically anarchy and chaos in Georgia and the Carolinas. As Atlanta falls, that news reaches Washington, D.C. by November of 1864, in time for the election. Lincoln wins a sweeping election victory And his opponent was his fired general from 2 years ago, George McClellan. And he wins in a pretty dramatic fashion, and he is elected to a second term. Now, rehearsals for Reconstruction at the end of the war. As territory was regained, debates on how to move forward arose, and obviously this is something that will come back, be discussed a lot. The Sea Islands experiment off the coast of South Carolina was some 10,000 slaves were freed. When all the whites left, Northerners moved to help them, teach them, educate them, improve and improve the slaves' lives. Large businesses brought up the land and worked to pay the new laborers. So that was an early on type of experiment. Wartime Reconstruction in the West, as Louisiana and Mississippi Valley areas were retaken, planters were forced to sign loyalty oaths and employ their former slaves. The politics of wartime Reconstruction. By 1863, 10% plan of Reconstruction, amnesty, and full restoration of rights when 10% took an oath affirming loyalty to the Union. No place for blacks in shaping the future under this plan. You'll have the introduction of the Wade-Davis bill, which will be vetoed. Required a majority for whites to make pledge support to the Union and guarantee blacks equality before the law. It died when Lincoln refused to sign it. He let it do a pocket veto. In short, what you're seeing here is as 63, 64, and 65 drag on, as it becomes evident the North's going to win this war, we're taking baby steps of how to bring the southern states back in. And as we acquire those lands back into the nation or the Union, they're starting to experiment with what would be the best process to go forth. All right. Rehearsal for Reconstruction in the War II. Victory at last. Sherman's army, after leaving Atlanta, cut a 60-wide-mile swath through the heart of Georgia. You go to southern states today, Sherman is not a popular name, especially in Georgia, but he's a very effective military officer, modeled after Grant, and he does his job very effectively. Essentially, he's going to backdoor a lot of the southern states, and it's just going to be pretty devastating. When I got my master's, a person in my class did an analysis of the South Carolina insurrection. South Carolina was basically lawless for about a year. When Sherman marched through the Carolinas, they basically destroyed all governmental features in South Carolina. There was chaos. There was no law enforcement. There was no military. It was kind of just like everyone for their own, kind of like warlording a little bit. It's something we often don't think about in the Civil War. January 31st, 1865, Congress will pass the 13th Amendment, and one of the best features of the Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln is showing the passage of the 13th Amendment and the political process to get it done. The thing that they realized, and Lincoln realized, was if we don't pass the 13th Amendment before the war is over, it'll be much more difficult which is abolish slavery, to get passed once the Union is reformed after the Civil War. On April 2nd, Grant finally broke through Lee's lines in Petersburg and will capture Richmond, the capital of the South. April 9th, Lee will finally surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And there's a lot of stuff we could talk about the surrender. Grant was in a muddy uniform, a private uniform of general's rank. Lee comes in with this very nice pressed uniform, the southerner that you would think of the gentleman, and surrenders his sword, in which Grant gives his sword back and just simply says, "Tell your men to go home." And April 14th, actually I think it was April 5th, 7th, somewhere in there, Lincoln takes a tour of Richmond. He comes down from D.C. because it's within 30 miles, tours Richmond, and goes back up to Washington, D.C. By the 9th, as they surrender, there's great celebration, jubilation. And April 14th, Lincoln decides to relax for the first time in a long time and goes to Ford Theater to watch a play. And I don't think I need to explain that much more in detail. And that's the night he is shot. One interesting note about that night, when he was leaving, and there's a lot of rumor if you look through sources and stuff on this, as he left his butler that night, he usually said, "Bye, I'll talk to you later." All he said was, "It's our good night." He just said goodbye. It's one of those things. It's like, did he know what? Well, if you study Lincoln, he kind of felt he had a premonitions and that he was going to die and all this. So just kind of one of those interesting things about history is like words have power and meaning, and sometimes they kind of fittingly fit, maybe unintendedly. The last part there, War in American History. In 1877, when Grant left office, he toured the world and was greeted as a champion of freedom, a nation builder, and a military genius. He would be the first to admit, probably not any of those three. I just kind of fell into the role and did what I was asked. And like I said, Grant gets some bad raps about being drinking, but he probably had significant PTSD from what he saw and what he did. Not that he was, like the shell shock, getting blown at from artillery and all that. We're talking about the fact that he saw men die, he sent men to die and such. The War in American History laid the foundation for modern America. Slavery was finally gone, but will morph into what we'll think of the civil rights movement that will take another 100 years to complete. But slavery as itself was done. Dramatically increased the power of the federal government, and you're also going to see a reshaping of the South going from a rural community to much more industrialized as the country industrializes and leads to the Gilded Age. So, a lot of stuff in there. Hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, there's a lot more we could go on the Civil War, but this concludes the lecture on the Civil War and the end of the presentation. Thank you.